Space is infinite. It's cold, silent, and indifferent. But what happens when the horrors we fear the most don't come from the void, but come from within ourselves? Mouthwashing is a psychological thriller that tells a chilling story of isolation, desperation, and the monstrous transformation of one man. This is a story of Jimmy, and how his descent into madness tore apart the crew of the Tulpar. At its core, Mouthwashing explores one of humanity's greatest fears: isolation. The crew of the Tulpar wasn't just lost in space. They were lost to each other. The crash stripped them of resources, safety, and hope. But the isolation didn't just prey on their bodies, it devoured their minds. Jimmy wasn't always the villain. At first, he seemed like just another crewmate. Quiet, a bit petty at times, but harmless overall. However, something darker lurked beneath the surface. An unspoken dread that would ultimately consume him. His descent into madness wasn't born of the crash alone. It came from a fear of what awaited him back on Earth. Before the crash, Jimmy was already struggling with a sense of failure. The company they worked for, the Pony Express, was facing its inevitable collapse. With it went any semblance of security, financial, professional, or personal. Jimmy, already a man driven by petty desires and insecurities, couldn't shake the mounting dread that the world he had known was falling apart. For Jimmy, this wasn't just about a failed career. It was about survival in a world that was crumbling. And there was something more, something darker, that drove him to the brink. Jimmy had a secret, a crime that haunted him, even in the cold emptiness of space. He had raped Anya, and the fear of facing justice back on Earth gnawed at him constantly. The Pony Express's collapse gave him a false sense of security, but as long as he remained on board the Tulpar, he was still trapped in the horror of his own actions. There was no escaping it, not unless he could manipulate the situation and everyone around him to avoid retribution. Jimmy's descent into madness reached a horrifying turning point with Anya. Vulnerable and isolated, she became the target of Jimmy's predatory instincts. The once strong medical officer was no match for the sinister forces growing within him. His actions weren't about survival. They were about domination. And Anya, caught in the web of his cruelty, became his victim. Jimmy exploited Anya's isolation, feeding off of her fear and helplessness. His assault was not just a brutal act, it was a symbol of his complete power over her. Anya, once the lifeline of the crew, retreated into herself, broken both physically and emotionally. She fell silent, her body a living reminder of Jimmy's cruelty. The trauma of that night would stay with Anya forever. Her silence wasn't just grief, it was a manifestation of something far darker. A chilling reminder of Jimmy's violence. A pregnancy she could neither escape nor erase. Anya's tragedy wasn't just her own. It became the breaking point for the entire crew. When Anya locks herself in the med bay with Curly, Jimmy drugs Swansea so that he can manipulate Daisuke into crawling through the vent to unlock the med bay. Daisuke crawls through only to gravely injure himself in the process. Once the medbay is unlocked, you're met with two horrific scenes. One is Daisuke bleeding out with no hope for survival, and the other is Anya, the victim of a suicide. One caused by none other than Jimmy himself. When Anya asked Curly of how much time they had left on the ship, it was only then that she realized she had to give birth on the ship. And once the crash happened, it was only a matter of time. As the days passed and resources continued to dwindle, Jimmy's grip on reality began to slip. Paranoia set in, and his desperation turned into something far worse. Each passing moment pushed him further into madness, transforming him into a monster. His mind twisted and diluted, and the crew found themselves at the mercy of his delusions. Swansea, the only one who is even still alive at this point, tried to confront him. But it was too late. His defiance cost him his life, his body joining the list of those Jimmy had murdered in the name of control. And then came Curly. The captain, broken, helpless, and mutilated, all by Jimmy in a twisted display of dominance. Jimmy fed him pieces of his own flesh, delusional, believing he could somehow preserve Curly's life. It was a grotesque mockery of authority and control, and a final act of psychological destruction. The story reaches its horrifying conclusion as Jimmy's sanity completely disintegrates. Alone with the corpses of this crew, he stages a macabre birthday party, a grotesque symbol of his detachment from reality. The Topar was no longer a ship. It was a tomb. Jimmy's final act wasn't redemption. It was escape. He took the gun, and with one final pull of the trigger, he ended his own life. No punishment, no reckoning. Just a man who fled the consequence of his own actions, leaving behind nothing but the horror he'd wrought. And in the end, only one remained. Curly. Jimmy placed Curly in cryostasis before he died. And he remains as a silent testament to the nightmare aboard the Topar. His body frozen, his mind shattered, a final witness to the madness that claimed the crew. The true horror of mouthwashing isn't found in alien monsters or supernatural forces. It's in the fragility of the human psyche. Jimmy's descent into madness is a reminder that the greatest threats often come from within. In the infinite void of space, we are often forced to confront the terror of what it means to be human. The story of Jimmy and mouthwashing isn't just a tale of survival gone wrong. It's a harrowing look at how fear, guilt, and power can drive us to destroy everything around us, including ourselves.